Okay, let's continue, folks. Before we get into the next little thing here, it gets into something that I think is absolutely crucial in our business, and that is I think we should actually borrow a word from the medical profession, and that is triage. If we do an assessment of our exhibits, the case particulars ahead of time, and not get locked into a particular way of thinking, sometimes our results can go up. And this is all Monday morning quarterbacking. I'm not smarter than anybody else. This just happened over a period of time, and perhaps you can identify with my feeling that the lessons I remember most in life are the painful ones. So this comes as a result of some experience in that area. And to illustrate that, there's a little joke that researchers tell about the laboratory researcher who was working with a flea and its response to commands. And he had a flea on his lab table, and he said, "Jump," and the flea jumped. And he wrote that in his log, and then he took one of the legs off the flea, and he said, "Jump," and the flea jumped again. And he kept noting every time, and he would take another leg off. Finally, the flea's got one leg left, and he said, "Jump," and the flea just flexed it, trying to jump. And he wrote that down, took the last leg off and said, "Jump," and the flea just lay there. And he wrote in his log, "Important scientific breakthrough: when you remove all of the legs from a flea, it becomes deaf." So we do this in our business, and I absolutely love that story because it keeps me on track, because it is so easy to fall into a non-productive line of thought, to keep your options open, because there are factors. Why, for example, in the late 70s was ninhydrin such an incredible development in our business? In other parts of the world, when they read the reports and the papers, they wondered what we were smoking, because they weren't getting those results. And that kind of frustration, that kind of diversity of finding, translated itself into some of the best research that was ever done, and finally in the development of things like DFO. So we have to always remind ourselves we're dealing with an incredibly complex concept here. This is not, you know, we can make charts and show relative percentages and stats and so on, but we have to remember those are tremendously boiled down, and they're effective and helpful as far as they go, but if we rely too heavily on them, we end up going down places where we're not really accomplishing too much. So, having said that, now I'm going to start with April 1st, 1977, when we had our brand new laser, and it was pretty exciting days, I can tell you. But in the days that followed, we were doing a lot of exhibits, a lot of cases, and we weren't finding anything. And I was sort of reminding myself very uncomfortably that I'm the guy that talked my force into spending all this money, and not much was happening. So I continually prayed to the God of my choice that something was going to happen to justify this purchase. And then in the summer, after about 2 months of drought, operational drought, we got this case. And it consisted of about 80 fraud checks. And I examined them by laser and got 4 impressions. And all I could think was, "Oh, thank you, thank you. I promise I'll be good. Just thank you so much for this." And then I processed them with ninhydrin. Oh, one of them was identified as a suspect. Forgot to mention that. Treated them with ninhydrin, and I got 60 impressions. So 60 versus 4. You don't have to be Einstein to see that one. However, the one guy I identified by laser, even though I identified other suspects with ninhydrin, the one guy identified by laser was the only print that was matched back to him. So it was a net gain. And that's what we look for when we're doing research. We look for a net gain in either operational speed, cost, number of prints developed, number of criminals developed, whatever. But it makes very little sense to come up with a very snazzy, highly expensive technique that you could have accomplished with $1.50's worth of powder. So we have to be looking at net gain. And this was so wonderful to find that we got one guy identified with this that didn't come up by ninhydrin. And you know something? Over the years, the prints that I have seen myself that we've developed by laser alone, or by, I'm even falling into that habit, by inherent fluorescence alone, rarely come up with other techniques. So this is the surface of one of the checks, and this is the ninhydrin version of it in here. And can you see the kind of connect the dots, a little impression there? That's with ninhydrin, and this is the one with laser, and there's a full delta there. Very, very nice little print. Can you see it? Okay. Anyway, that was a revelation. So this is 1977. At this time, just to get back to the idea of the evolution here, oh, this is a shot of our first laser. Pretty hot stuff at the time. We were using front silvered mirrors to direct the laser. And this is before fiber optics came along. And as I mentioned before, when you wear the laser goggles, they have an optical density of 7 at laser wavelengths, which means they're about as transparent to laser light as that counter. And that, of course, is for eye protection. But it's also critical to the idea of seeing whatever it is you're looking to see. But as we found out in a lab like this, you can't see that the laser is on. And I have a number of shirts at home, one of which I kept for historical purposes, with a laser hole burned in the, because I wandered in front of the beam wearing my goggles. And we had a 20-watt laser. And at the time, people would think, 20 watts? I got 100 watts in my kitchen. But that's not coherent light. And that's not dealing with the watts per square centimeter. 20-watt laser will burn through wood, and it burns through shirts, I can tell you from personal experience. And you wouldn't believe how quickly you move when you feel that laser touching you. So this is where we started. And as an idea of the absorption of that light energy and the conversion to heat, this is symptomatic of how it would burn out our optics. We were replacing those front silvered mirrors that we used to direct the light at the rate of about 2 a week, simply because they were not efficient enough reflectors to avoid damage. They were absorbing way too much of that, and then as they started to get damaged, they would absorb more and more, and then they'd just split and crack, and they'd be gone. So we needed something that was better, and we ended up with these high-efficiency reflectors. I think it would be perhaps, well, they are mirrors as a sense, but they're very, very expensive, and they were in these optical mounts on an optical bench. And this is basically how we positioned the laser for that first period of time. So you had this cone of light at the bottom. We have here a thing called a spatial filter. It's an achromat lens and a pinhole, and it actually would expand the beam out to a nice cone of light that you can see here. Before that, as you can see, we're talking about a glowing line of high intensity monochromatic light that in that stage, of course, is totally useless for examination purposes. You need to expand the beam. So here the beam is fixed and you move the exhibit around, which is fine if it's an aerosol can, not so good if it's a trunk tire or a truck tire or a washing machine. So we were limited in what we could do under that kind of a setup. Something very interesting happened around 1980, and I'm not sure if anybody here would remember it, but there was the introduction of the first Yag Laser. And I was asked by the Buffalo Police to go down and attend a demonstration and to give my opinion. And it was a very exciting prospect because we're talking about mainframe gas lasers, first of all, which are, we're going to talk about this in more depth. We're talking big, we're talking expensive, we're talking unpredictable and temperamental, expensive to run as well as to buy. And along comes this company with a Yag laser that's portable. It's about the size of a briefcase and a half, plugs in the wall, and is air-cooled, and is quite robust. And it's a laser, but it is a solid-state laser. It's not a gas laser, not an ion laser. So it had 532. We're going to talk more about this afternoon, or rather in the next session about the specifics of the light output. But at any rate, here's the kicker. This is a pulse laser. And the low repetition rate was a problem. If you have a repetition rate of about 30 hertz or 30 pulses per second, that is indistinguishable to the human eye. So to all intents and purposes, it's a solid continuous wave laser. But at 15 or 16 pulses per second, what you're doing is working with a very irritating strobe. Now, everybody in this room, I'm sure, at one time or another has examined exhibits in low light levels. Maybe you've examined 50 bags or a large number of exhibits in low lighting situation. After a while, you just have to take your glasses off, go for a coffee, rub your eyes, and then start fresh. Imagine with the strobe going off all the time. Couldn't do it. So, great idea, they just didn't take it quite far enough. Discontinued. The next great advantage or advance we had was the introduction of good fiber optics. And again, because of the power we were dealing with, the interfaces on these things were so important. The attenuation rate is almost nothing. So it didn't matter. You didn't lose a whole lot of light as a function of distance from the source. But where you do lose light is in the exchange point or the connection point between two media. So when you go from the laser light into the optical fiber, that's where you can lose power, and that's where you can sustain damage. So that surface has to be really, really high efficiently accepting of that very, very powerful light. And in fact, the existing fiber optics were no good because they were glued bundles of smaller fibers together, and the minute that 20 watts or even 10 or 5 watts of laser power hit that, it burned the glue, and within seconds, you've lost transmission. So we had to have an optical fiber that was one single fiber, 600 microns in diameter. Now this is the slide that Carrie wondered about the importance of. One of the things about lasers is they produce coherent light. And this means that all of the light photons are in phase. They are ordered in the way that a body of marching men go with all their right feet down at the same time, all their left feet down at the same time. And if you compare that to a source like this, any of these sources where it's random and they're out of phase. So it's like a body of marching men compared to a bunch of shoppers in a mall. So this is a shot of the coherent nature, the speckled nature of that. And if you look very closely, I think you can see that it's almost like a Monet painting, that there are little specks of blue and little specks of green. So this is all lines lasing, where we have those two important lines, the 514.5 and the 488, together. But as I say, they're in phase, they're coherent. And if you are looking for fingerprints or anything, you don't want this. You want it to be blended and smooth the way we have with our other lighting, because that will translate itself in terms of any fluorescence you generate. And if you have a very borderline fingerprint, you're not going to get the detail. You're going to be building in artifacting and not see it. So we had one of my colleagues came up with the idea to get a $5 aquarium pump and jiggle the optical fiber. So we just had this glued down to the optical, or taped down to the optical bench, and when we turned the laser on, it would just shake it and dissociate that coherent pattern so that we would go from that to that. And it's more effective when the lights are out, and it's way more effective when you have, when you're actually looking and seeing fingerprints. So that made a big difference, and so we had that incorporated in. But that is kind of a inevitable property of lasers, this coherent function. So now we've gone from that fixed point to where we can actually take the wand and use it much the way we do today with a crime scope or a polylight. We started doing bodies, and we had already, as part of our offered protocol, we had already been doing bodies with the iodine silver plate technique, and Diego and I had a conversation at the break about this, and that's the subject of a whole other day or 2 days or whatever. It's a huge, huge area, but I'm a huge believer in sequential processing, to go from the least invasive to the most invasive, have as many shots at it as you can, because you don't know what that print, if it's there, is composed of. So if we go at it through its fluorescent properties, which it may have, doesn't mean it's going to have the properties that are required for detection through one of the other techniques. So this gives you an extra shot at it. Then we ended up with a second laser. So now we've got 2 lasers, one on the bottom, one on the top, and both with fiber optic connections. And we had our lab kind of divided off, so one side was used for examination and the other side for photography. And then we finally got one dropped through the floor to our garage so we could examine vehicles. Going to talk about some cases here. In 1991 to 92, we had a serial killer in Ontario, hugely affecting the policing in our province, affected everybody. I mean, everybody, I'm sure, has had a serial killer at one point or another in their jurisdiction, and you know what it does to the public. And it's a very tense period. Anyway, the suspect's home was discovered, and the home had been examined by Lumalite. And Lumalite and Polylight were kind of the 2 first light sources to come out. We're going to talk more about their properties, their anatomy, a little later on, but for the moment, sufficient to say that the Lumalite at that time was leading edge. In my opinion, it hasn't progressed the way the other light sources have over time, but there's no question it was a very bright source, and this was the biggest case that just about anybody on this case had ever had in their career. So they spent a long time. The house was completely stripped of all the contents, and it's almost a quote, a direct quote from the individual who did the examination, saying there were traces of ridge detail but nothing worth photographing. And if there'd been any chance that something would have been useful, you know they would have done it. Anyway, they called us. They'd had the house in their possession for probably a month, and they'd done everything they could do, and they called and said, is there anything else we can do? And the same fellow in my staff who came up with the idea of the aquarium pump, and if you're lucky, you've got a person like this in your lab. You've got an Inspector Gadget. You've got somebody who's always a little outside the box, and they may be a little offside in other areas, but that creative approach to the job is so important. Anyway, we were having a kind of a round table, and he said, well, you know, we could take our laser down there. And I said, well, how would we do that? Because it's 3-phase power, 50 amps per phase, water-cooled. You're like a piano player in a marching band. So he said, well, I can climb the hydro pole and hardwire it. And I thought about the lawsuits and so on, and I thought, no, I don't think that's going to happen. Anyway, we ended up getting the loan of a generator, this antique from the Canadian military, and we did the first, to my knowledge, the first crime scene on location examination with a mainframe laser. And on a humorous side, it was really quite funny because everybody knows that when you have a major scene identified, the media are around like ravens on a roadkill. And they were all standing on the road, and they would look, and we had to wait for nightfall. There were simply too many windows to tape up and close off the light, so we just waited for nightfall to do the examination. And so when nightfall came, there's all these flashing blue lights in the upper story of the house, and the media were going nuts, and no one would talk to them. It was like a Spielberg movie, you know, the close encounters with all these blue lights. But the offshoot of that, and that's my inventive colleague on the right, the offshoot of that was when he examined that residence by argon laser, he found 40 untreated impressions that the Lumilite had missed. Yeah, this is a good one to see. Honestly, it's a lot better than it looks here. And then these are just two examples of the 40, including one full bare footprint. So again, there was a net gain. There was a difference in what those two. Now, that led to the development of this unit, which is called a mobile crime unit. And this was pretty hot stuff in 1995. We had this big truck with a 50 kilowatt generator on board, an internal circulation system for the laser, and the ability basically to take it anywhere and do crime scenes. And we had a 100 feet of fiber optic cable and 100 feet of plug-in, so we could take the laser 100 feet from the truck and then the business end 100 feet from there. And I did the office stats for those years, and we found additional evidence with this mobile capability in 40% of the cases we attended. That's a net gain in 40% of the cases.
What surface did you find the prints on?
Oh, door jambs, window sills, cupboard doors, none of the contents, because they'd already been taken away and processed in other ways. We didn't get to the crime scene until something like 6 weeks after they actually discovered it and took it over. But they were all, I guess you'd have to say, painted surfaces, mostly painted surfaces. I think there might have been some on appliances, but my memory's a little vague on that.
So none of those surfaces had been previously processed by anything
No,
else?
nothing. Totally untreated. And Then in the 90s, we get the reintroduction of the Yag Laser, new and improved. Portable, durable, plugs in the wall, 532 emission. Now it's a different emission. Remember, the argon laser on single green line was 514.5, and this laser was 532, so you're deeper into the green, but a much better pulse rate. So it is, to all intents and purposes, a continuous wave laser. Still got the speckle problem, though. So that had to be dealt with. We tend to forget, when we look back in time, what we were working with, what we had exposure to during a given period of time. So from 1977 till fairly well along, we didn't have anything but, there were no extension techniques. It was not until about 1980 that Roland Menzel came up with adding the dye staining component to the glue chamber results. And that, to me, is one of the biggest advances of the last century. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. It was amazing the way our stuff went up, the results went up as a result of being able to dye stain and see things that you couldn't see by glue alone. But anyway, these are all cases now laser alone, no treatment at all. And they didn't happen on consecutive days. They're spaced over a period of time, but here they are. A paper napkin found beside a body. It was the only physical evidence with the case. And a laser examination was done, one impression located, identified as the accused, and as I found frequently in my career, it was not detected by anything else, in this case, ninhydrin. That's what the napkin looked like. That's not it, but it was a napkin similar to that. And again, generational loss, but it was a beautiful print. It didn't have a huge contrast, a very wide dynamic range, but the detail was unbelievably crisp and clean. This is a copy of a copy of a copy. Is anybody here, or I should say, is everybody here familiar with valerian tripha? Just show of hands if you are, because I don't want to. Okay, then you're all by yourself.
I'm going to put my hand down.
You're well informed.
No, I'm not.
Okay, so this is one case you really should know about. There was a cardinal in the Romanian Orthodox Church, very highly placed, somewhere on the eastern seaboard. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe you know, Ken. Was it in Washington area or New York? One of the.
I'm not sure.
One of the two, I think. Anyway, one day somebody recognized him and said, this guy was a war criminal. He was a member of the Romanian Iron Guard during the war, and he was responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people. This is an accusation that he denied. But as a result of these accusations, the State Department mounted an investigation. And their investigation took them to Germany, where they got permission to examine archival documents on the condition that they not alter them or deface them in any way. And I don't think the Germans completely trusted the FBI, because they sent a guardian along with the exhibits to make sure that that's all that happened. Well, of course, if we can't put chemistry and stuff on, that really reduces our options. All that could be done was examination by light. So a number of very significant things happened as a result of this case. First of all, an impression was located on a postcard. Again, untreated, inherent fluorescence. It was identified as the suspect, or subject, I should say, valerian tripha. And the recipient was Heinrich Himmler, not a great guy to be associated with. And the print was 42 years old. That document had been in the German archives since 1942, and this was 1984. So it had real staying power. Now, as a result of this, And Mr. Trifa denied this almost till the day he died, and just before he died, he admitted that he was that guy. But on the basis of the evidence, he was deported, not for being a war criminal, but because he had lied on his immigration information. And there's no limitation on that. So that was a huge milestone because it gave us an idea that time really wasn't always going to be a problem. You couldn't rule something out because it was old. So a lot of the things that we can expect to fluoresce and detect are not necessarily impeded by the passage of time. This was a case I worked on, a fish knife with a varnished wooden handle. I don't know if anybody's a fisherman in the crowd, but Rapella, just very standard fish knife. It had been examined by powder, and we had a pretty much a directive out to our people. If you want something examined by laser, don't do anything else to it first, because that's just going to mask everything. But in this particular case, it was important enough someone had been stabbed. We did decide to process it anyway, or to look at it. And when you look at it, and I'll show you the slide in a minute, the main reason was it didn't even look like it had been processed. There just wasn't enough there for the powder to do much more than adhere to the cracks in the varnish. And it was identified as the suspect. So that's the handle, and you may be able to see just little bits of black powder adhering to the cracks in the varnish along that handle. And under laser light, it was a very nice impression. Lots of characteristics. This was on a brushed aluminum ashtray from a homicide, and again untreated, and that was criminal item as well. This is an interesting one. This comes from the homicide of a police officer who answered a silent alarm, and when his backup got there, he was already dead, and it was in a commercial area, and there had been 2 doors that had been kicked in, and the ident officer used a flashlight obliquely, and he thought he saw something, so he just did a very rough grease pencil mark. And what happened was you could see a little bit, just a disturbance in the sort of background pattern of the paint. But when we took it in and looked at it under monochromatic laser light, the reflective properties were different, and this is actually oblique laser. And this is without a filter of any kind. And the important thing, or the interesting thing about this one was, this is obviously an old pair of sneakers, and the top layer had actually worn off on one corner. And you can see where the top layer has worn off. That's all accidental, that whole edge. And it was exactly the same on both the impressions on the doors. You could overlay it, and it was like looking at a satellite shot of the Colorado River. And if you're a footwear person, that's got to turn you on, because you're usually looking for little gouges and nicks and stuff, but that whole continuous line was accidental. Improvised explosive device. This one came from the RCMP. It failed to detonate. If it had, it would have caused loss of life. Once again, black electric tape. The fingerprint detected by laser as it was unwrapped and identified as the accused. That's the device, and the tape was all unwrapped, and that was the print. Might be going out on a limb here, but I think we can work with that print.
And do you guys process it further once you had that result? You go ahead and photograph it, obviously, and then do you go to a next step like sticky side powder or wet wop or ultraviolet, any of that?
Now we would, but this was in 1979 or 1980, and we didn't have any of those things then. But now we would, yeah. And you brought up a good point, because you have to remember what you had at the time, what was around. And I don't think even gentian violet was out at this time. But certainly, yeah, we would have. I'm a big fan of tape as an exhibit. I just get, my pulse quickens when somebody has an exhibit with tape on it, because it has certain advantages that you don't have with ordinary or other exhibits, I guess I should say. For example, we depend on passive transfer when we, Locard's principle basically, when we process paper or plastic bags or coffee cups or anything for fingerprints. So that it's totally dependent on just a passive transfer. Whereas when someone is working with tape, that material is actively being wrenched from the surface. So you get a really good continuous transfer of material. If there's stuff there, it's going onto the tape. And the second thing is, because it's very difficult for somebody working with tape to sort of smear their fingerprints or through torque twist them, the detail is usually very crisp and clean. And the last thing about it is you can draw an inference of culpability there that you can't always draw with a passive transfer. For example, if you find the fingerprint of a guy who has on that bomb, it's a pretty clear indication that he's the guy who made the bomb. And it's not always possible to draw such an inference if you have a fingerprint on a piece of paper or a plastic bag where the defense is going to say, Your Honor, at the time my client touched that, there wasn't a pound of cocaine in that bag, it was a ham sandwich. And of course, we're not able to say that that's not the case. But when you have a fingerprint on such a surface, it indicates culpability pretty strongly. So the weight of it is much greater. This is a case involving a homicide victim. Body parts were found all over Ontario, as much as 60 miles apart, in an effort to thwart identification. So we found a pair of feet in an area along the upper shore of the St. Lawrence River. And limited autopsy was done, and they thought perhaps that someday we might be able to identify this through foot morphology, or be able to say that a particular shoe had been worn by these feet. This is pre-Bob Kennedy stuff too. Anyway, this is in ordinary room light with the tops cut off the shoes, and the image under laser light showed a very clear, crisp configuration of the toes versus the ball of the foot. And there was another one on another pair of shoes, and it was almost a virtual overlay. It was very, very, very close. And as I say, this is pre-Bob Kennedy, and we couldn't find a podiatrist, a forensic podiatrist, who would be able to, because there was no ridge detail in this at all. It's just a blur. But significant finding nonetheless. Okay, we look at alternatives. What did we have, 76 to 79? There were no alternatives on the horizon at that time. Almost immediately, people were looking to find an alternative because of the problems that the baggage the laser has. So there were no chemical extensions until Menzel came up with the Rodeman 6G extension for glue. And as I say, that combo was greater than the sum of the parts. It increased exponentially the reach that we had on certain kinds of exhibits. And I think it was the single biggest advance of that whole period. This is a great example of exactly that, of a net gain. This is a glove box, a pebbled surface. I'm sure everybody's seen that before on a car. And surfaces like that we typically didn't bother examining with powder because it just didn't respond well. So you can see something's happened here because it's been circled and there's a scale there. This has been glue fumed and then sprayed with Rodeman, And not only did it give a fingerprint, there were something like 37 or 38 characteristics in the print. So this opened up a whole new area of exhibit that previously we hadn't even bothered with, and we started getting huge submissions from our drug investigators and doing a lot more vehicles. And it really made a big difference. But around 1979 to 1980, we had the appearance of the first alternatives. The Lumalite from Canada, the Polylite from Australia, and the Omnichrome from the US. And these were developed primarily for revealing glue dye prints. There is no documentation that I'm aware of untreated fingerprints being detected by alternative or broadband light source from that period of time. So we have the Polylite PL500. Didn't look like that in its first incarnation. So let's look at the alternative light sources as they've been called for all those years. Much cheaper than lasers, much safer than lasers for eyes, cheaper to run, air-cooled, portable, relatively low maintenance. And then the second extension came out around 1985. I can't be more precise than that, but Menzel came up with the idea of using metal chlorides. Some of them were toxic than this, but they went to zinc, and it was a post-ninhydrin treatment, so that if you had a print that, as I call them, a connect the dots print with ninhydrin, use of the zinc chloride would convert the rumen's purple to a fluorescent compound, and then it would be visible through excitation with a light source. But in my experience, it was a crapshoot. It was not a dependable technique. You couldn't rely on it. It would come through sporadically, but that was about it. Oh, and Joseph Almog from Israel and his group came out with the ninhydrin analogs because they were one of the groups across the world who was frustrated with the poor showing of ninhydrin in their country and their climate. So they came out with things like 5-methoxy ninhydrin, 5-methylthione ninhydrin, and there were a whole bunch of others. And some of them would turn the print green, some blue. Most of them were really not that great. They were a lot more expensive to make than ninhydrin and didn't produce appreciably better results. But now there's a focus on developing fluorescent property. And this is another example. This is, as I say, connect the dots ninhydrin. And this is after zinc chloride. Actually, maybe this will do it. So big improvement there, but this didn't happen every day. So you just never knew when zinc chloride was going to come through. Has anybody here used zinc chloride successfully? Or anybody have different results from what I'm saying, or did you see it as sporadic as well?
Just in the classroom
okay.
atmosphere.
Yeah. Well, like a lot of other things we do, they work great in testing, and then in the real world, that's a little tougher. Somebody from Print Track once said that in theory, there's no difference between practice and theory, but in practice, there is. So now the focus is on developing fluorescent reagents. So how can we exploit the properties of these light sources so we would find that people are actually looking? It's no longer a happy accident. They're actually looking to make things fluoresce. And around 1990, Tony Pounds from the UK came up with DFO, which was, again, one of the signature developments of the last century. Fluorescing fingerprint reagent, excited by argon laser or quotations ALS. Ninhydrin post-DFO reveals more detail. So you have a complementary arrangement here where the they can support each other. The ninhydrin is capable of revealing stuff that was missed by the DFO, even though overall DFO is exponentially more sensitive than ninhydrin. And the perceived value of the laser once again diminished, because no longer did you have to rely on a laser. You could have a light source which was considerably less expensive. So that's a nice DFO print. Then around 2000, Joseph Almog of Israel again, and Madeleine Julier of the University of Pennsylvania, the two of them were collaborating on research with indane-dione and another ninhydrin analog, and it is a fluorescing fingerprint reagent, a fairly quiet color mode, but an unbelievable fluorescent mode. It is my reagent of choice for paper now, and the Secret Service made that decision, as have the Australian Federal Police. They rate it as 10 times as sensitive as DFO. And it can be excited again by either one. Anyway, that's indane-dione print.
Brian?
Yeah.
Wasn't there some kind of issue with the formulation for a while, so people were having poor results? And was that one?
Oh, yeah. We come back to the story of the flea. Like, there has been a ton of headaches involved in the evolution of the thing. The first, we've had a number of different formulas. We've had a number of different post-dipping treatments. First treatment called for the same as ninhydrin with the humidity chamber, and now it's dry heat. And I think the dust is beginning to settle on this whole issue, and even people who honestly and sincerely had lousy results with indane-dione in its first years are now saying, yeah, their results are better. So then around 2000, again, we have the introduction of LEDs, the light-emitting diodes, really cheaper, cool, efficient, robust, tremendously robust, no moving parts, very portable. The spectral output can be made to be similar to lamps, and they've kind of taken the place by storm. And then in around 2006, I was in the Boston IAI meeting when I was first introduced to this device. It's a semiconductor laser called Coherent Tracer, and optically pumped semiconductor. Again, plug in the wall, battery option, 2 hours of cord-free use, cool, efficient, robust, very portable. Output wavelength can be engineered, and this is really quite critical. If you have a need for a specific wavelength in order to excite something, they can manufacture the laser, which will give you monochromatic light at that. In fact, they already have a laser that lasers at 460, one line, and another one at 5, I'm going to guess, don't hold me to this, but it's around 575 in the yellow. And that has some tremendous implications for the future. But the current version is 532, and there's no coherent speckle. That's been solved internally, and I really like that piece of equipment. I like it generically. It's just I'm not aware of anybody else marketing it, that type of laser other than them. So that's what the machine looks like. You're going to get a much closer look at it. And now, I've talked about what lasers found that was not found by light sources. We had another serial killer who everybody, I'm sure, is aware of, the pig farm in British Columbia. More than 25 victims. Farm examined by laser and FLS. I've got FLS here rather than ALS. We'll get to that in the next presentation. There was a palm print detected by the forensic light source, identified as a victim, and it wasn't detected by the laser. So we come here to a kind of a an interesting situation. So filtered lamps, 1980 to present, the Lumilite, the Polylite, the Omnichrome, the Crime Scope, all good pieces of equipment, but these are example of the same kind of technology where you have a white light source with a specific exciter filter to isolate a band of wavelengths for a particular job. There were all of those things. We're going to get more into this in the next session when we talk about the actual comparisons and so on, but that is it for this session. So anybody have any questions, comments, or personal experiences vis-a-vis light sources, lasers? And anybody here worked with both on one case or on that kind of thing? And if so, what were your experiences?
We had the Yag Laser when I first started at our agency, and it was the pulsating thing. It just would drive you crazy, and you'd end up with a headache after 15, 20 minutes of looking at something.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a nuisance, and then we ended up going to the Lumilite and have that, and currently the Crime Scope as well. So I'd much rather use an alternate light than the laser, but I haven't seen the newer one that's out there. I've seen it at the IAI, but not actual casework.
Well, you're going to get a chance to see it this afternoon and to look at some things with it. I really do like it as a piece of equipment, and I think I'll save my sort of conclusions or observations till we hit that part of the presentation. But anybody else? Yeah.
Kind of interesting. We had one where there was a limited amount of fluorescence on a piece of paper, hit it with the laser because we have the coherent. The thing cranked right up and it was very easy to photograph. Now, just 2 days ago, one of the new people was working on a piece of duct tape and they treated it with basic yellow. And I thought that the coherent would crank that thing right up. Quite the contrary. It was actually the specs that brought it up. In the coherent, it was just about negligible as far as the difference. So you had one instance where, yeah.
Yep. Another important scientific axiom is that if two things are different, they're not the same. And we're going to talk more about the differences between those two sources when we get into the next presentation. But that is something that has been mirrored by, and when you said yellow, your basic yellow, like
yeah.
BY40.
Yep,
Yeah,
on duct
okay.
tape on, yep.
Yeah, that's, we're going to address that very issue, and we're going to actually see it when we go into to look with the light sources.